On a Tuesday morning in late October of 1987, a construction foreman named Greg Thornton stood at the edge of a muddy equipment yard in Platte County, Nebraska, and watched $60,000 worth of deadline evaporate into the ground. His Caterpillar D6D had thrown a track the day before, not just derailed it, but cracked 3 consecutive track pads so badly they'd folded like wet cardboard under the machine's own weight. The job site was a county road widening project, 7 miles of grading work, and the county inspector had already been out twice that week. The penalty clause in the contract kicked in at 30 days. They were on day 26. Greg was 38 years old, and he had built his equipment business from a single used motor grader he'd bought at a farm auction in 1974 for $9,000. By 1987, he had 4 machines, 2 full-time operators, a shop on the edge of Platte Center, and a reputation in 3 counties for finishing jobs on time. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who had learned through 13 years of hard work that every problem had a solution if you were willing to pay for it. So he paid. He called the cat dealer in Columbus first, who told him the replacement pads were on back order from the factory, 6 to 8 weeks minimum. He called a dealer in Omaha. Same answer. He called a salvage yard in Lincoln who had 1 usable pad, not 3. He called a fabrication shop in Norfolk who could build custom pads, but needed 3 weeks and a $4,000 deposit. He had 26 days on the clock and a machine sitting dead in the mud, and none of those answers were good enough. Let me tell you about what happened in that equipment yard over the next 4 days, because it's the reason this story is still being told in Platte County 35 years later. And it starts not with Greg Thornton, and not with the cat dealer, and not with the fabrication shop in Norfolk. It starts with a 16-year-old kid named Emmett Kowalski and a pile of cracked Dozer track pads that everyone else had already written off as garbage. Let me tell you about Emmett Kowalski because you need to understand the boy before you can understand what he built. Emmett was 16 years old in the fall of 1987, and he lived on a 280-acre farm 3 miles east of Platte Center, on a county road that turned to gumbo in the rain. His father, Casimir Kowalski, everyone called him Cass, had farmed that ground since 1961, the same year he'd come back from 2 years working in the Chicago stockyards with enough money saved to make a down payment on the place. Cass was a corn and soybean man, methodical and careful, who kept his equipment running past the point where most men would have traded it in. Not because he was cheap, but because he understood that a machine you know is worth more than a machine you don't. His father before him had farmed in the same county, and his grandfather had broken the original ground with a team of horses in 1912. The Kowalski family had been putting seeds into Platte County soil for 3 generations, and the land showed it. Dark, well-tended, properly drained. Emmett was the youngest of 3 children, and the only one who had inherited his father's mechanical instinct in full measure. His older brother, Stefan, had gone to work at the grain elevator in town. His sister, Renata, had married a man from Columbus and moved east. But Emmett had been taking engines apart since he was 9 years old, first a dead lawnmower that his father let him have, then a seized-up ATV that a neighbor had abandoned in a fence row, then progressively more ambitious things. A worn-out hydraulic pump from the farm's old tractor, a broken PTO shaft assembly he'd found at a farm sale for $2. He had a shop in the corner of the Kowalski barn, which was really just a workbench made of 2x10s and a pegboard hung with hand tools. But by the time he was 14, he'd added a used arc welder his father had bought for $75 at an estate sale. And by 15, he'd taught himself to run a bead from library books and from watching, very carefully, the way the local co-op mechanic worked when he came out to service equipment. What made Emmett unusual was not just that he could fix things. Plenty of farm kids could fix things. What made him unusual was that he understood why things broke. He thought about failure modes the way other kids thought about baseball stats. The root cause, the stress concentration, the material property that had given way first. When the farm's old John Deere 4020 cracked a front axle housing in the spring of 1986, Emmett was 14 years old, and he stood there looking at the fracture for 20 minutes before his father finally asked him what he was thinking. He said, without looking up, that the crack had started at the edge of a bolt hole where someone had drilled it slightly off-center, and that the misalignment had created a stress riser that had been slowly propagating through the casting for probably 3 or 4 years before it finally let go. Cass Kowalski looked at his 14-year-old son and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How do you know that?" And Emmett said he'd read about it in a metallurgy textbook he'd found at the library in Columbus. Cass didn't say anything else, But he started paying attention to his youngest son in a different way after that. By the fall of 1987, Emmett had built a reputation of sorts among the farms and small operations in the area around Platte Center, though reputation is probably too grand a word for it. What he had was a series of small successes that people talked about at the co-op and the feed store. The hydraulic cylinder he'd repaired for the Gustafson farm when the dealer wanted $800 for a replacement, and Emmett had done it for parts and $40 labor. The cracked cast iron manifold on the Lindgren family's old combine that 2 different shops had told them was unrepairable, and Emmett had brazed back together on a Saturday afternoon. He wasn't charging much because he didn't have a business license and he was 16 years old, but people remembered, and people talked. Now let me tell you about the cracked track pads, because that's where this story really begins. When Greg Thornton's D6D threw its track and cracked those 3 pads, the machine sat in the equipment yard for 2 days, while Greg made his phone calls and got his bad news. On the 3rd day, one of his operators, a man named Delmar Webb, who had grown up 4 miles from the Kowalski farm and had known Cass since childhood, mentioned the kid. He didn't make a big production of it. He just said, in the way that men in Platte County said things they weren't entirely sure about, that there was a Kowalski boy who was good with metal, and that maybe it was worth a conversation. Greg Thornton looked at Delmar Webb for a long moment. He had 4 days left before the penalty clause became a serious problem. He said, "How old is this kid?" Delmar said 16. Greg said, 16. Not as a question, just as a statement of the situation he had arrived at. He drove out to the Kowalski farm that afternoon. Emmett was in the barn when Greg's truck pulled into the yard, and Cass came out to meet the truck first. Greg explained the situation, the cracked pads, the back order, the deadline, the fabrication shop's 3-week timeline. Cass listened with his arms crossed and his face neutral in the way of men who have heard many problems and solved some of them and know the difference. Then he called Emmett out of the barn. Emmett came out wiping his hands on a rag, a thin kid with dark hair and his father's square jaw, wearing a canvas work jacket that was 2 sizes too big for him. Greg Thornton looked at this 16-year-old boy and felt, he would later admit, a specific kind of desperation, which is the kind that comes when you realize you have run out of better options. Greg explained the problem again. Emmett listened without interrupting. When Greg finished, Emmett asked 3 questions. He asked what steel the original pads were made from. Greg didn't know. Emmett said that was fine. He could test for it. He asked whether the cracks had gone all the way through the pad or only part way. Greg said all the way on 2 of them and part way on the 3rd. Emmett nodded. Then he asked if he could see the pads. They drove back to the equipment yard together, Emmett riding in the passenger seat of Greg's truck, and when they got there, Emmett walked straight to the cracked pads and crouched down and looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then he touched the fracture surfaces with his fingertips, feeling the grain of the brake. Then he stood up and looked at the track assembly as a whole, the sprocket, the idler, the rollers, the way the track had folded when it failed. He walked around the machine twice. Greg Thornton and Delmar Webb stood and watched this 16-year-old kid conduct what was, though neither of them would have used this word for it, a forensic examination of their broken equipment. After about 10 minutes, Emmett said he thought he could fix them, not replace them, fix the actual cracked pads, repair them to functional condition. Greg asked how. Emmett said he'd need to do a spark test on the metal to identify the alloy, and then he'd need to preheat the pads before welding to prevent additional cracking, and then he'd need to build up the worn surfaces with hard-facing rod, and then he'd need to let them cool slowly. He said it would take him probably 2 full days of work, maybe 3. He said he'd need the pads brought to his shop. Greg Thornton looked at this boy. He said, "You're 16 years old." Emmett said yes. Greg said, "Have you ever welded track pads before?" Emmett said no, but he'd welded cast steel before, and he understood the principles. Greg said, "What if it doesn't work?" Emmett looked at him steadily and said, "Then you're in the same place you're in right now." That was, Greg would later say, the most honest answer anyone had given him in 4 days of phone calls. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. If you were Greg Thornton, standing in that equipment yard with 4 days on the clock and $60,000 of contract penalty hanging over you, and a 16-year-old farm kid was the only person who had offered you anything other than a waiting list, what would you do? Most men in that position would have kept calling dealers. Most men would have told themselves that a professional shop was the only responsible choice. Most men would have dismissed the kid the moment they heard his age, because 16 years old and a barn welding setup is not what you picture when you picture a solution to a serious equipment problem. Most men would have been wrong. Greg Thornton was not most men, or at least on that particular afternoon he was not. He said, "All right, let's get those pads loaded." Let me tell you about what happened in the Kowalski barn over the next 52 hours, because those 52 hours are the reason this story exists. Emmett Kowalski started with the spark test. He took a small angle grinder to a corner of one of the cracked pads and held the stream of sparks against a dark background and watched the pattern, the length of the sparks, the way they branched, the color at the tips. He'd read about spark testing in a welding handbook he'd borrowed from the Columbus Library, and he'd practiced it on scrap pieces of known steel until he could read the patterns reliably. What he saw told him the pads were made from a medium carbon steel, probably in the 1045 range, which was harder and stronger than mild steel, but also more prone to cracking during welding if you didn't manage the heat correctly. This mattered enormously. Welding medium carbon steel without preheat was how you turned one crack into three. He told his father what he'd found. Cass listened and asked what he needed. Emmett said he needed a way to preheat the pads evenly to around 400 degrees Fahrenheit before he started welding, and to keep them warm during the process, and to let them cool slowly afterward. Cass thought about this for a moment and then said they could use the old propane torpedo heater from the machine shed and build a simple insulated box around the work area with fire bricks and sheet metal. They spent 2 hours building that setup together, father and son, on the floor of the Kowalski barn, and when they were done, Emmett tested it with a temperature crayon, a stick of heat-indicating wax that melts at a specific temperature, and confirmed he could hold the pads at the right preheat range. He started welding at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening. He used low-hydrogen rod, which he'd driven to Columbus to buy from a welding supply house that afternoon, paying for it out of his own savings. Low-hydrogen rod was more expensive than the standard electrodes he usually used, but it was the right choice for medium carbon steel because it reduced the risk of hydrogen-induced cracking in the weld zone. He'd read about this in a structural welding manual. He had not been trained by a professional. He had been trained by library books and by paying attention and by doing the work until he understood it. He welded in short passes, letting each pass cool slightly before adding the next, building up the cracked areas in layers. He checked the interpass temperature with the temperature crayon between passes to make sure the steel wasn't getting too hot or cooling too fast. On the 2 pads where the cracks had gone all the way through, he welded from both sides, grinding the backside clean before turning the pad over. On the 3rd pad, where the crack was partial, he excavated the crack with a grinder first, cutting a V-groove down to clean metal before filling it back in with weld. This was not guesswork. This was procedure, learned from books and applied with care. His father checked on him every hour or so, bringing coffee and standing in the barn doorway watching without saying much. At around midnight, Cass said, "You should sleep." Emmett said he was in the middle of a weld sequence and couldn't stop. Cass looked at the setup, the glowing pads in their insulated box, the arc welder humming. His 16-year-old son crouched over the work with his welding helmet pushed up and a temperature crayon in his hand. And he said, "All right," and he went back to the house. Emmett finished the crack repair on all 3 pads by 2 in the morning. Then he wrapped each pad in a heavy wool blanket, actual wool, because wool holds heat and doesn't burn easily, and left them to cool slowly through the night. Slow cooling was as important as the preheat. If you let medium carbon steel quench quickly after welding, you could harden the heat-affected zone to the point of brittleness, and then you hadn't repaired anything, you just moved the failure point. He slept 4 hours and was back in the barn at 6. In the morning, he unwrapped the pads and ground the welds flush and inspected every repair surface carefully under a work light. The welds were sound. No visible porosity, no crater cracks, no undercut at the edges. But the crack repair was only part of the job. The pads also needed their working surfaces built back up because years of use had worn the grouser bars and the pad faces down past the point where they'd grip reliably. This was where the hard-facing rod came in. Hard-facing was a welding technique where you deposited a layer of extremely hard, wear-resistant alloy on top of the base metal to rebuild worn surfaces. Emmett had used it before on tillage tools for the farm, on cultivator sweeps and plowshares, but applying it to track pads required more precision because the geometry of the pad surface mattered for how the track seated on the sprocket and rollers. He spent Friday working on the hard facing, building up the worn surfaces in careful passes and then grinding them to the correct profile. He'd measured the original pad dimensions before he started, and he worked to those measurements, checking his progress with a straight edge and a set of calipers he'd borrowed from the school shop. By Friday afternoon, he had all 3 pads repaired, crack welded, hard-faced, and ground to profile. He wire brushed the surfaces clean, hit them with a coat of black spray paint to prevent rust, and stacked them in the corner of the barn. He called Greg Thornton at 5 o'clock Friday afternoon. Greg arrived at the Kowalski farm at 6. He walked into the barn and Emmett showed him the pads. Greg picked one up and turned it over in his hands, running his fingers along the weld repairs, looking at the hard-faced surfaces. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "These look like they were professionally done." Emmett said, "They were." Greg looked at him. Emmett didn't smile. He just waited. Greg loaded the pads into his truck. He said he'd have his mechanic install them Saturday morning, and they'd know by noon whether they held. Emmett said they'd hold. Greg asked how he could be sure. Emmett said, "Because I did it right." Let me tell you about the following Monday because that's when the story changed. The pads went on the D6D Saturday morning. The machine ran through Saturday afternoon and all day Sunday on the county road project, grading and compacting, and the pads held. They didn't crack. They didn't shift. The track ran true on the rollers and the sprocket, and the machine performed exactly as it should. Greg Thornton finished the county road project on day 31, thus 1 day past deadline, but within the grace period written into the contract, which meant the penalty clause never triggered. He saved his contract. He saved his reputation. He saved, by his own later accounting, somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 in delay penalties, rush fabrication costs, and lost future work. On Monday morning, he drove back out to the Kowalski farm. Emmett was in the barn when Greg pulled in, same as before. Greg came in and stood in the doorway of the shop corner and looked at the workbench and the pegboard and the welder and the fire bricks stacked in the corner from the preheat setup. He looked at all of it for a moment. Then he said, "What do I owe you?" Emmett had thought about this. He said $60 for the welding rod and supplies and $40 for the labor. $100 total. Greg Thornton looked at this 16-year-old boy who had saved his construction business and said, "That's not enough." Emmett said, "That's what it cost me." Greg said, "That's not what I asked." He paid Emmett $300, which was 3 times what Emmett had asked. Emmett tried to give back the difference and Greg wouldn't take it. Greg said, "You charged me for your costs. I'm paying you for what it was worth." Then he said something else. He said, "I'm going to tell people about this." Emmett said that was fine. Greg said, I'm going to tell everyone." He did. Now let me tell you about what happened in Platte County over the next 18 months, because this is where the story stops being about track pads and starts being about something else entirely. Greg Thornton was a man with a wide acquaintance in the construction and farming community of Platte County and the surrounding area, and when Greg Thornton told a story, people listened. He told the story of the cracked track pads and the 16-year-old Kowalski kid at the co-op, at the equipment dealer, at the County Contractors Association meeting in January of 1988. He told it with the specificity of a man who wanted to be believed. The part numbers, the timeline, the phone calls to the dealers, the 3-week quote from the fabrication shop in Norfolk, the 52 hours in the barn, the pads that held. He told it the way you tell a story when you want the person listening to understand that you are not exaggerating. The calls started coming to the Kowalski farm in November. A farmer named Lyle Peterson from the east side of the county had a cracked cultivator frame he'd been told was scrap. Could the Kowalski boy look at it? A small gravel contractor named Harlan Dykstra had a worn bucket on his loader that needed hard facing. Could the kid do that? A dairy operation outside of Humphrey had a broken PTO shaft yoke that the dealer wanted $400 to replace. Could he fix it for less? Emmett said yes to all of them. He said yes because he could do the work, and because the work interested him, and because each job taught him something the last one hadn't. The cultivator frame was gray cast iron, which was different from the cast steel of the track pads and required a different approach, a nickel-based electrode and even more careful preheat management, because gray cast iron was famously difficult to weld without cracking. He researched it. He practiced on a piece of scrap cast iron he found at a salvage yard. Then, he repaired Lyle Peterson's cultivator frame on a Saturday in November for $35 in materials and 2 hours of work, and the repair held through the following spring planting season without incident. The loader bucket for Harlan Dykstra took him a full day and required him to build a simple fixture from scrap steel to hold the bucket in position while he welded, because hard facing on a curved surface wants to pull and warp if you don't control the sequence carefully. He'd read about weld distortion control in a fabrication handbook, and he applied what he'd read. The bucket came out straight, and the hard facing extended its working life by at least 2 seasons, which saved Dykstra the cost of a new bucket, somewhere around $800 at the time. The PTO yoke for the dairy operation was the most technically interesting of the 3. The yoke was a forged steel component, and the break had happened at the weld joint between the yoke body and the shaft, which told Emmett that the original weld had been undersized for the load. He didn't just re-weld it, he redesigned the joint, adding a gusset that distributed the load over a larger area, and he used a higher strength electrode than the original weld had called for. He charged $40. The dairy operator offered him $100, and Emmett took it. By the spring of 1988, Emmett Kowalski had completed 14 repair jobs for 11 different customers in Platte County and the 2 adjacent counties. He had not advertised. He had not put up a sign. Every job had come from word of mouth, and every job had come back to the story Greg Thornton had started telling in November. He was still 16, 17 in March, and he was still doing his homework and still feeding cattle before school and still sitting in the Platte Center High School shop class where the teacher, a patient man named Mr. Borgman, had run out of things to teach him by Christmas of his sophomore year. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened in the Platte County Equipment Dealers Association meeting in February of 1988, because it's the part of this story that most people in the county would rather forget. The association met quarterly at a steakhouse in Columbus, and the February meeting included a discussion of what one dealer, a man named Rick Prescott, who ran the largest equipment dealership in the county and had been in the business for 20 years, called the underground repair problem. What he meant by this, and what he said explicitly at the table, was that unlicensed individuals performing equipment repairs were undercutting legitimate shops, creating liability exposure for equipment owners, and doing substandard work that would eventually cause accidents. He said this with the confidence of a man who had been the authority in his field for long enough that he'd stopped questioning whether he was right. Someone at the table, the account of who varies depending on who tells it, mentioned the Kowalski kid specifically. Rick Prescott asked how old the kid was. When he heard 17, he laughed. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who found the situation self-evidently absurd, who could not imagine that the conversation needed to go any further than the age of the person being discussed. He said, "A 17-year-old farm kid with a barn welder is not a repair shop. He's a liability waiting to happen." He said the track pads that Greg Thornton had bragged about were probably luck, and that the next job might not be lucky, and that when something failed because a teenager had welded it, someone was going to get hurt, and Greg Thornton was going to be explaining himself to a lawyer. He was not entirely wrong about the legal and liability landscape. He was entirely wrong about Emmett Kowalski. The problem with Rick Prescott's analysis was that it was based on the category, unlicensed teenage welder, rather than the specific instance. He had not seen the track pads. He had not watched Emmett perform a spark test or read a temperature crayon or calculate preheat requirements from first principles. He had not seen the library books stacked on the workbench in the Kowalski barn, the welding handbooks, the metallurgy texts, the structural fabrication manuals, the ASM International Guides to Steel Properties that Emmett had been reading since he was 14 years old. Rick Prescott knew what category Emmett Kowalski belonged to, and he knew what that category was worth, and he did not look past the category to see what was actually there. Word of what Prescott had said got back to the Kowalski farm, as words in small counties always do. It got back through Delmar Webb, who had a cousin who worked at the steakhouse in Columbus and had been clearing tables during the association meeting. Cass Kowalski heard it first and told Emmett that evening at supper. Emmett listened without expression. He finished his meal. He said, "Is the Sievert farm still looking for someone to repair their grain auger housing?" Cass said he thought so. Emmett said, "I'll call them tomorrow." That was all he said about Rick Prescott. Let me tell you about the 18 months that followed, because what Emmett Kowalski did in those 18 months was not dramatic. It was not a single moment of triumph. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was the accumulation of work done correctly, job after job, in a barn on a county road in Platte County, Nebraska. He repaired the Sievert grain auger housing in March of 1988. He repaired a cracked boom on a small crane for a concrete contractor in April. He rebuilt the cutting edge on a road grader blade for the county highway department in May. The county road superintendent, a man named Norval Johansson, had heard about Emmett from Greg Thornton and called the farm directly. The county had a budget for equipment maintenance, and Johansson was always looking for ways to extend the life of the fleet. Emmett's work on the grader blade cost the county $400. A replacement blade from the dealer would have been $1,800. By the summer of 1988, Emmett had completed 31 jobs. He had not had a single repair fail in service. He had not had a single customer complaint. He had, without intending to, built what was effectively a functioning mobile welding and fabrication business out of a barn, a used welder, a set of library books, and a reputation that grew entirely by word of mouth. He was 17 years old. That summer, Norval Johansson at the County Highway Department asked Emmett if he'd be willing to do a larger project, rebuilding the worn pivot pins and bushings on 3 aging motor graders that the county had been considering replacing. The machines were functionally sound, but the wear in the articulation joints had gotten bad enough that the operators were struggling to hold a grade. New machines would have cost the county somewhere around $120,000 each. Emmett looked at the machines and said he could rebuild the pivot assemblies for parts and labor, and quoted the job at $2,200 for all 3 machines. Johansson said yes before Emmett finished the sentence. The pivot rebuild took Emmett most of July and part of August, working evenings and weekends around the farm work. He machined the worn bores back to round using a boring bar he'd built from a length of cold-rolled steel shaft and a carbide insert he'd bought from an industrial supply catalog. He'd read about line boring in a machine shop textbook. He'd never done it before. He practiced the technique on a piece of scrap steel until he could hold the tolerances he needed, and then he did the actual work. The rebuilt graders went back into service in September. They were still in service, with no further pivot wear issues, when Emmett graduated from high school in the spring of 1989. Now let me tell you about the spring of 1989, because that's when Rick Prescott came back into the story. Prescott's dealership had been the authorized CAT service center for Platte County for 15 years. In the spring of 1989, the County Highway Department's service contract came up for renewal. Norval Johansson recommended to the county board that they not renew the dealership contract for routine maintenance work, and instead contract directly with Emmett Kowalski for equipment repair and maintenance services. He presented the board with a cost comparison. In the 18 months since the county had started using Emmett for repair work, they had spent $11,000 on equipment maintenance. In the comparable previous 18-month period using the dealership's service shop, they had spent $31,000. Same fleet, same usage, substantially different cost. The work had held, nothing had failed, no one had been hurt. The county board approved the recommendation. Rick Prescott found out about the contract through the same network of small county information that had carried everything else in this story. He drove out to the Kowalski farm on a Thursday afternoon in April. Emmett was in the barn. He was always in the barn, and came out when he heard the truck. He recognized Prescott's dealership truck by the logo on the door. He waited. Prescott got out of the truck and stood in the Kowalski yard and looked at this 18-year-old kid who had just taken a county maintenance contract away from his dealership. He said he'd heard about the county board decision. Emmett said yes. Prescott said he thought they should talk. Emmett said all right. They stood in the yard. Prescott said he'd been wrong to dismiss the trackpad repair the way he had at the association meeting. He said it in the way that men who are not accustomed to being wrong say such things. Carefully, with qualifications, not quite as an apology but in the direction of one. He said he'd looked into what Emmett had been doing, the jobs, the methods, the results, and he said it was clear that the work was sound. Then he said what he'd actually come to say. He wanted to know if Emmett would be interested in a formal arrangement with the dealership, not employment, he was careful about that word, a subcontract arrangement. Emmett would handle certain repair categories, particularly the difficult fabrication and welding work that the dealership's shop struggled with, and Prescott would provide the customer referrals and handle the administrative side. Emmett looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You told people my work was luck. You said I was a liability waiting to happen." Prescott said he had. Emmett said, 31 jobs, 18 months, 0 failures. He wasn't angry when he said it. He said it the way you state a measurement, precisely and without emotion. Prescott said he knew. Emmett said, "The county board looked at the numbers. $11,000 versus $31,000. Same fleet, same time period." Prescott said he knew that too. Emmett said, "So what changed?" Prescott said, "You proved it." Emmett said, "I proved it in October of 1987 when I handed Greg Thornton 3 repaired track pads that you told him couldn't be fixed." There was a silence in the Kowalski yard. A crow called from the tree line to the east. The wind moved through the grass at the edge of the gravel. Then Emmett said, "I'll think about the arrangement." He did think about it, and he eventually declined, not out of pride, but because the subcontract structure Prescott proposed would have limited his ability to work directly with customers, and direct customer relationships were the foundation of everything he'd built. He told Prescott he appreciated the offer and that he'd be willing to refer work back to the dealership in cases where the dealership was genuinely better positioned: warranty work, parts supply, major component replacement. Prescott said that was fair. They shook hands. Prescott drove away. Emmett went back into the barn. Let me tell you about what Emmett Kowalski built over the next decade, because the trackpad story is only the beginning, and the beginning only makes sense when you see what it led to. He graduated from Platte Center High School in May of 1989 and enrolled that fall at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln in the mechanical engineering program. He did not stop doing repair work. He drove home most weekends of his freshman year to handle jobs that came in, because the reputation he'd built was real and the customers were real, and he was not willing to let either of those things go dormant while he was in school. His father fielded the calls during the week and kept a list, and Emmett worked through the list on weekends. By his sophomore year, he had enough work that he hired his first helper, a kid from Platte Center named Ferris Albright, who was 17 and mechanically inclined and willing to learn, and whom Emmett taught the same way he had taught himself, from books and from doing the work, and from paying attention to why things failed. He graduated from Nebraska in 1993 with a mechanical engineering degree and a business that had, by that point, outgrown the Kowalski barn. He built a proper shop on a parcel of land his father sold him at the east edge of the farm, a steel building 40 by 60 feet, with a concrete floor and a bridge crane and a proper welding station and a small machine shop with a lathe and a mill that he'd bought used from a closing manufacturing plant in Fremont. He incorporated the business as Kowalski Industrial Services. He hired 3 full-time employees in the first year. The county highway department contract renewed. Greg Thornton's construction company became a regular customer. The word-of-mouth network that had started with 3 cracked track pads in October of 1987 had, by the mid-1990s, extended across 4 counties and into the industrial plants along the Platte River corridor, ethanol facilities, feed mills, grain elevators, a cement plant outside of Columbus. These were not small jobs. These were major equipment overhauls, structural fabrication projects, precision machining work that required exactly the kind of first principles understanding that Emmett had been building since he was 9 years old and taking apart a dead lawnmower in his father's barn. Rick Prescott retired in 1997. His son took over the dealership, and the son had a different temperament than the father, less certain, more curious, more willing to acknowledge what he didn't know. He and Emmett developed a genuine working relationship over the years that followed, the kind where each party understood what the other was good at and referred work accordingly. At Prescott's retirement party, which was held at the same steakhouse in Columbus, where the Equipment Dealers Association had met in February of 1988, someone told the trackpad story. Rick Prescott listened to it and laughed, a different laugh than the one from 1988, smaller and more private. The laugh of a man who has lived long enough to find his own certainty amusing. He said, "The kid knew more about welding medium carbon steel than anyone in my service department." He said it without bitterness. He said it the way you say something true that you should have said earlier. Let me tell you one last thing about Emmett Kowalski, because the story doesn't end with the shop or the engineering degree or the county contracts. In the spring of 2004, Emmett's daughter Maya was 7 years old, and she had already developed the habit of sitting on a stool in the corner of the shop and watching her father work. She didn't talk much while she watched. She asked questions occasionally, careful, specific questions about what he was doing and why. And Emmett answered them the same way he'd have answered an adult, completely and without simplification. Because he believed that children who are given real answers develop real understanding, and children who are given simplified answers develop simplified understanding. Maya had her grandfather Cass's eyes and her father's way of looking at things that were broken, with patience, and with the particular kind of attention that is trying to understand before it is trying to fix. In 2019, Maya Kowalski graduated from the Colorado School of Mines with a degree in metallurgical engineering. She came home to Platte County that summer and walked into the shop and told her father she wanted to talk about the business. Emmett said, "All right." She said she'd been reading about directed energy deposition, a form of metal additive manufacturing, essentially 3D printing with metal, that could rebuild worn surfaces and repair complex geometries that were difficult or impossible to fix with conventional welding. She said the technology had matured to the point where a mid-sized industrial shop could justify the equipment cost, and that the repair applications in agricultural and construction equipment were significant and largely untapped in the rural Midwest. She had a business case. She had the numbers. She had read the literature. Emmett Kowalski sat across from his daughter in the same barn where he'd welded track pads at 2 in the morning in October of 1987. And he looked at her the way his father had looked at him 32 years earlier when he'd explained the stress riser and the cracked axle housing, and he said, "Show me the numbers." She showed him. He said yes. That is what happened when a 16-year-old kid asked for cracked Dozer track pads that everyone else had written off as garbage. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask for credentials. He asked to see the problem, and then he went home and read everything he could find about it, and then he fixed it correctly, and then he let the work speak. The track pads held. The county contracts followed. The shop followed. The engineering degree followed. The 40-year business followed. And now his daughter is rebuilding worn metal surfaces with technology that didn't exist when Emmett was learning to read a spark test by the light of a work lamp in a Nebraska barn. The equipment changes. The principle doesn't. You look at what's broken. You understand why it broke. You fix it correctly. You let the work speak. That's what happens when a kid who was told he was a liability waiting to happen decides to prove otherwise. Not with an argument, not with a credential, not with a lawsuit or a letter to the association. With 52 hours in a barn and a temperature crayon and 3 track pads that everyone else had already decided were done. They weren't done. They were waiting for someone who knew what they were worth.